That Leicester rejection at 15 is wild. Most kids would just fold right there. He basically got told, not here, maybe nowhere. And that hits different when you are still a kid. The crazy part is he was still getting battered by older lads outside. So rejection in the academy and tackles in the park. Proper free training for the Premier League, honestly. But that Northampton scholarship story is the real pivot. Everybody else is celebrating, and he is still waiting for the phone call. That is such a cruel little room to be in. Imagine being the only one not told yet. That kind of silence can mess with your head. And then the scholarship lands, and suddenly the whole story changes. That is the first real proof to him that he is not done. Football really does love embarrassing you before rewarding you. Then Newcastle at 18 feels massive, but also kind of dangerous. Because that is where young players start thinking they have arrived. And then the personal shopper shows up, so obviously the brain melts. Bro, that is exactly the trap. He said it straight up too, cruise control. That is the part people never warn you about. You go from proving yourself to acting like the job is done. And his dad's message was basically, keep the mentality even if the badge changes. That is such a powerful line for a young player. But being 18 and hearing hard work starts now is annoying too. Of course it is annoying, you think you made it. Then he gets loaned out and that must sting. You do not feel like a project, you feel like you were sent away. Especially after all that hotel crowd energy at Newcastle. Man said he was getting recognized straight away like a superstar. But the loans are where the football truth hits him. League One does not care about your Premier League dreams. It will absolutely bash you around and ask for more. Scunthorpe, Barnsley, Shrewsbury, Wigan, that grind is no joke. And he is still scoring, so the lesson is not pretty, but it works. 4 loans later, and the man is still saying he belongs in the Prem. That confidence is either elite or slightly delusional. Maybe both, which is probably perfect for a striker. The Wolves thing is the other huge moment, though. They literally gave him a number and then walked it back. That is such a brutal emotional whiplash. And the scoliosis explanation makes it even stranger. Because now the issue is not just football, it is your body. Hearing somebody say you might not be walking properly later is heavy. At 18, you do not even have the language for that fear. He seems to have filed it away until later in life. That is the weird thing with young athletes. They only process danger when they slow down. And then Peterborough becomes the reset button. That feels like the first place where somebody really trusted him. Steve Evans basically said, come here and be the main guy. That is all a striker wants to hear, honestly. Give me the ball and stay out my way. And the hard part is that he was not even playing right away. 10 games on the bench can humble anybody. Then he takes the chance and scores 24 and 32. That is outrageous output. Plus all the dirty work, heading away corners like a center back. Best defender on the team as a striker is hilarious. That is very striker behavior, by the way. Goals get the headlines, but effort is what keeps the manager loving you. I liked that he kept saying he wanted honest feedback. Because sugarcoating ruins careers. If the club thinks you are not good enough, just say it cleanly. He and his dad sound like they would hate fluff immediately. That Peterborough timing also matters because he becomes a father. That changes the wiring in your head instantly. Suddenly it is not just about ego, it is about providing. Expensive taste plus a baby equals serious motivation. Bro literally said, I have to score to fund the lifestyle. But that is real pressure, not the fake social media kind. That kind of responsibility can sharpen you fast. Then Brentford comes in and the whole tone shifts again. Thomas Frank telling him he will be the main man is huge. That is such a clean pitch compared to all the noise before. He was done with maybe and interested. Correct, because interest is free and bids are real. That is one of the coldest football truths. And the Rangers and Celtic interest shows he had options. But he wanted a place where he was central, not decorative. Imagine being told you are striker number 3 and smiling about it. Not him, absolutely not. Brentford also sounds like a club that matched his personality. Work hard, stay humble, no status games. That kind of environment is rare when people start getting famous. And he really keeps coming back to togetherness. Like the club philosophy is almost bigger than the talent. Which is annoying for all the ego merchants, by the way. No little superstar clicks, just lunch and go work. That self-policing culture sounds strong there. If someone is sloppy, the standards catch it immediately. And then the goals explode anyway, which is the crazy part. 20 goals in a Premier League season is no joke. Finishing behind Haaland and Kane is absurd company. He still sounds dissatisfied, though, which is the striker mindset. Of course he is upset about missed chances after scoring 20. That is exactly why elite scorers stay elite. He is never patting himself on the back for long. That is probably why the climb kept going. And then England enters the picture. That has to feel unreal when you came from non-league conversations. Just hearing him describe that dream makes it bigger. But the World Cup omission clearly still bothers him. He thinks the timing around the betting allegations was suspicious. And you can understand why he would feel that way. The whole thing got bigger than football very fast. That is the part that must have felt impossible to control. One minute you are discussing form, the next it is your life story. Football loves acting like it is just football until it absolutely is not. What I keep thinking is how many times he got told no. Leicester no, Wolves no, Newcastle loan no, England maybe no. And somehow every no turned into fuel. That is the whole story, really. He was basically collecting disrespect and converting it. Proper striker economics right there. The mentality piece is the loudest theme in all of it. Talent got him in the room, but mentality kept him there. And maybe that is why his story lands so hard. It is not a smooth rise, it is a messy climb with bruises, which is way more believable than the fairy tale version. Exactly, and that is why I want to stay with this one. Because the next layer is where it gets even more complicated. The betting case changes everything around the football, and we have to sit with how heavy that must have been. We will get into that because that is a whole different beast. For now, though, the rise itself is already ridiculous. From park fights to Premier League pressure, that arc is insane. And honestly, that is where we leave it for a second. Next time, we get into the part that really changes the room. The one where football stops pretending it is simple. The crazy part is he got hardened before he even got hopeful. Like he was getting battered by grown men in a park at 8. That is not youth development. That is survival training. And that changes everything when he gets to the academy level. Because rejection at Leicester at 15 can break a lot of kids. Most kids hear no and start editing their whole life story. He still had the itch, but he clearly got scared for a second. That part felt real to me, honestly. You do not hear enough athletes admit that rejection makes you go quiet. Everyone acts brave after the comeback. Nobody wants to talk about the wobble. And his parents basically pushed him back into the fire. Which, shout out to them, because that is elite parenting. I do think that early rejection makes people either softer or meaner. He went the productive route, which is annoyingly rare. Then Northampton becomes the first real proof that he belongs. And that scholarship moment is huge because it is not glamorous at all. It is literally waiting in a dressing room while everybody else celebrates. That is such a brutal little cinematic detail. But that patience is the first sign of the player he becomes. Did you notice how often he said nothing is done until it is done? That comes from getting burned once too many times. And then the Wolves thing happens, which is just savage. Bro, they gave him a number, took pictures, and then backed out. That is cold even by football standards. Imagine packing mentally for a move and being told your spine is the problem. The scoliosis part is wild because he is hearing a life sentence at 18. And he is just sitting there like, okay, but I am playing right now. That is such a young person reaction to something scary. Your body is potentially betraying you, but you are still thinking about training. That is the weird thing about athletes. They normalize alarming stuff. And then Newcastle comes in and suddenly the whole thing accelerates. League 2 to Premier League is a ridiculous jump at 18. He is acting like a guy moving neighborhoods, not a guy changing universes. But you can hear how fast the money and attention hit him. That is where a lot of young players get weird. Personal shoppers are how you know the plot is getting dangerous. When someone else is shopping for you, the delusion is already in the room. And I actually liked that he admitted he was in cruise control. That is rare honesty because most people rewrite that phase later. He needed someone to slap the Premier League fantasy out of him. Instead, he got loan spells in places where everyone wanted blood and second balls. That is the point, though, where football stops being a dream and becomes a job. Barnsley, Shrewsbury, Wigan, Scunthorpe, that is the furnace. And he basically said, yeah, I thought I was too good for that. Which is such a striker thing to say, by the way. But that loan route is probably the thing that actually made him real. You hear him talk about being bashed around again, and it all connects. He had already built a tolerance for chaos. And that father advice is massive too, because the mentality sounds hereditary. I love the line about being a Premier League player in your head while playing in League One. That is either elite self-belief or the beginning of a very expensive mistake. Sometimes it is both at once, honestly. But that is what keeps him from shrinking in lower leagues. And then Peterborough becomes the actual springboard. 24 goals in 32 league games is outrageous. That is not a hot streak, that is a threat. The funniest detail is the director of football calling him their best defender. Because apparently the corners were just magnetized to his forehead. But that says a lot about coaches valuing total contribution now. And about him being willing to do ugly work for the group. That is probably where the mature version of him starts. The move from Newcastle to Peterborough can look like a step down on paper. In reality, it was the exact reset he needed. Because he is not chasing status anymore, he is chasing minutes. And then Brentford happens, which honestly feels like the perfect club for him. That place just rewards hard workers who can live inside a system. He kept saying togetherness, humility, attitude over and over, which is code for nobody is allowed to be precious here. Exactly, no superstar vibe, no fake hierarchy, just work. And that is why the club overachieves without acting surprised by it. The interesting part is that he says they are not even the most gifted team. But he keeps coming back to trust and repetition. That is the culture piece people underestimate all the time. You can have talent and still be divided into little camps. Brentford sounds like a place where that nonsense gets stripped out fast. Also, the humility thing is easier when everyone is sitting together at lunch. No luxury bubbles, no weird social islands, just food and accountability. And then he starts talking about the golden boot race like he is annoyed by his own success. Third behind Haaland and Kane is absurd. But he is still looking at missed chances instead of trophies for himself. That might be the real elite trait right there. He is not comforted by external praise. He is haunted by what he left on the pitch. That is probably miserable to live with, but great for goals. And then the England dream gets dragged into the conversation, which is where the whole thing gets emotionally loaded. Because once you are in that orbit, football becomes politics too. He clearly feels the timing around the allegations was not random. And I get why that would feel poisonous as a player. You are finally close to the thing you dreamed about. Then the room changes. Even without getting into the whole case yet, that uncertainty is brutal. Especially when your whole story has been one long fight for respect. The universe really looked at his career and chose hard mode. It did, and he somehow kept asking for more. That is what makes the rise feel bigger than the stat line. It is not just goals, it is the amount of nonsense he had to absorb. And still keep moving. That is the episode really, this long climb built on rejection and friction. Next time, the conversation gets way heavier when the football stops being the main story. We are getting into the part where everything gets tested at once. That Leicester rejection at 15 is brutal, man. That is the age where one sentence can wreck your whole head. And yet he heard that and basically said, fine, I will go elsewhere. Most kids do not even have the wiring for that at 15. Yeah, it is not even football then, it is identity. What I loved was he did not pretend it felt good. He was like, no, I wanted to disappear for a bit. Which is such a real reaction, by the way. Then Northampton basically becomes the place that saves the whole thing. And the timing of that scholarship call is insane. Everybody is celebrating, and he is still sitting there on trial like, hello? That is a movie scene with a terrible delay. But that delay matters because it teaches patience early. Or paranoia, depending on how your mind works. Fair, because after that Wolves thing, I would trust nobody either. Bro, they gave him the squad number and then said, nah. That is such a cold football thing to do. And the scoliosis piece makes it even more confusing. Because now you are not just being judged as a player. You are being told your body is the problem. That can get into your head in a nasty way. Especially when you are 18 and do not even know how permanent life is. And then at 27, you are like, wait, I am still here. Did he ever sound like he really believed the warning? Not really, which is kind of insane in itself. Athletes are built like maybe that doctor is the one who is wrong. Not always wrong, just inconvenient. The Newcastle move is where it gets dangerous in a different way. Because success becomes louder than development. Exactly, and he is 18, away from home in the Prem. Then he is in a hotel with people outside like he is already a superstar. That kind of attention can absolutely fry your brain, especially if you think you have already made it. That was the biggest line for me, honestly. He basically said the real work starts after the dream comes true. But his head was in cruise control, by his own admission. He said, if I were moving, I would put the handbrake on. That is such a savage self-own. Still, that honesty is why the story lands. And then the loans happen, which most fans treat like demotions. But for young players, that can be the actual education. League One football will humble your ego in 5 minutes. He literally said you get bashed around, which is very direct. The ball is one thing, the body is another industry. And the dad advice is a huge theme too. That mentality of acting like a Premier League player wherever you are. Not delusion, just standards. That is a really clean distinction. Because if you drop your standards at Shrewsbury, you carry that forever. And the funny part is he still thought he was going back to Newcastle anyway. Which is where the youth optimism can turn into stubbornness. Then Peterborough becomes the reset he probably did need. Steve Evans sounds like the kind of manager who sees the hunger fast. Also, the man said go and score goals, like very simple instructions. No philosophy, just violence and finishing. But that honesty probably helped him relax. And then he turns into a monster at Peterborough. 24 goals in 32 League One games is absurd. That is not a bounce back, that is a takeover. Plus, being called their best defender because of headers is hilarious. Striker tax, score goals, defend corners, do everything. And I like that he did not make the manager sound like a father replacement. It sounded more like respect plus trust, which is healthier. Though honestly, some managers do become weird proxy family figures. Football clubs are just workplace therapy with drills. The Brentford chapter is where the culture really shows up. Hard work, togetherness, humility, all the boring words that actually win. Boring words, elite results. That is the annoying truth about good teams. And he loves that nobody is above anybody there. That is huge for a player with his background. Because if you come from rejection, status can mess with you fast. He was also very clear that Brentford are not just technical talent merchants. He basically said, we have magicians, but mainly we run, which is the most efficient Premier League pitch ever. And the self-policing culture is what makes it stick. You can hear how much he values the dressing room being one big unit. Not factions, not status groups, just everyone together. That sounds simple until you have egos and contracts. Then it becomes a monthly miracle. The thing is, he keeps connecting football to responsibility. First it was his dad, then his kid, then the club. Each step adds weight, but also clarity. And then you get the season where he scores 20 in the Prem. Behind Holland and Kane, which is just outrageous. He still goes, yeah, but I should have scored more. That is striker brain disease in the best way. It is also why he stays dangerous. Because he is not sitting there celebrating the number. He is staring at the misses. That is how you annoy yourself into getting better. England is the other emotional peak in this whole thing. You can tell that dream still felt unreal to him. From the front of the park to the national team is wild. And then the World Cup squad miss becomes this huge cloud. He is clearly not buying the cleanest version of events. He thinks the betting allegations timing was no accident. Which, if true, is a nasty way to shape a career. Because that is not just selection, that is reputation warfare. And he is trying to separate the football from the noise. Which is nearly impossible once the public story takes over. But I respect how he kept dragging it back to the game. Even when everything around him was trying to become a soap opera. Yeah, he is basically saying, I know the headlines, but I know my work. That is the through line of the whole episode, really. Rejection, then repetition, then responsibility. And somehow the order matters more than the talent. Talent got him in the door. Mentality kept him alive. That is a good line, man. All right, let's leave it there and let that breathe. Next episode, we get into the part where football stops being the biggest battle. And that is where things get a lot more uncomfortable.